There was a man once, just like 1,000 other good men who have clocked in and out of 1,000 gray factories across this country. He believed in the gospel of the honest day's work, in the steady churn of the gears, in the sweat that earned every dollar. He figured life was a simple equation. You put in the hours, you put in the effort, and eventually, bit by bit, you'd build yourself a piece of that good life. Maybe not a mansion, maybe not a yacht, but a little something. A simple dream tucked away like a lucky penny in his work boot. A fishing boat, perhaps, bobbing gentle on a quiet lake. A real family vacation, somewhere the air smelled of salt, not steel. He thought success was a linear path, a straight shot if you just kept your head down and pushed. He believed in the map. What he didn't realize was that the map never showed the hidden tolls, the detours, the treacherous quicksand patches that could swallow not just your progress, but a piece of your very soul along the way. Dreams, you see, they whisper sweet promises, but they rarely mention the full bill. That man, his name was Garrett. He was 47 years old, give or take, though the deep lines etched around his eyes and the permanent stoop in his shoulders often made him look closer to 60. He'd worked the line at the old steel fabrication plant since he was barely out of high school, same as his old man before him, same as his grandpa. 25 years, give or take, of the same deafening clang, the same acrid smell of oil and hot metal, the same relentless rhythm of man and machine. You could see the life he'd lived etched into him, not in fancy clothes or a shiny car, but in the landscape of his hands. Knuckles swollen and scarred, fingers thick and strong, the skin on his palms calloused like old leather, permanently ingrained with a faint metallic sheen. They were the hands of a man who built, who fixed, who carried more than his share, literally and figuratively. His face wasn't soft, not in the way you see on television. It was weathered, perpetually tired, sun-beaten from weekend yard work and the endless drive to and from the plant, even in the dead of winter. His hair was thinning, mostly gray now at the temples, but it still had that stubborn, unruly wave that refused to lie flat. His eyes, though, they were the part that told the real story. Behind the general quietness, past the gruff, world-weary exterior he'd worn like a second skin for decades, there was a deep-seated weariness, yeah, but also a quiet, almost stubborn strength. A strength that showed itself in the way he'd nod, listening more than talking, taking it all in, processing the world with a slow, deliberate thoughtfulness. He wasn't a man for big speeches or grand gestures. Garrett was a man of small, consistent efforts of showing up, day after day, year after year. He lived in a small, single-story house, nestled in a quiet, working-class subdivision on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was his. Well-maintained, always a fresh coat of paint where needed, the lawn neatly trimmed, a testament to his practical, no-nonsense approach to everything. Inside, it hummed with the lives of his wife, Sarah, sweet and steady at 45, and their 2 kids, Lily, 16 and blossoming fast, and Mark, 12, all energy and questions. For them, he worked. For them, he'd swallow the drone of the machines, the ache in his bones, the endless monotony of the assembly line. He carried a deep, quiet ambition for a better, simpler life for them. A life where he didn't just exist, but truly lived sometimes. Buried deep beneath the layers of responsibility and the dust of the factory floor lay his own simple dream. A modest fishing boat, perhaps, nothing fancy, just something stable enough to feel the tug of a bass on the line, to watch the sunrise paint the water in peace. And maybe, just maybe, one real vacation for his family. Somewhere warm by the ocean where Sarah could relax and the kids could make memories that didn't involve the smell of steel. He believed hard work alone would eventually pave the way to these dreams. He thought success was a linear path, just putting in the hours, not realizing the hidden costs. He carried a fear, a quiet, constant hum beneath his ribs, the fear of failing them, of not being enough. But beneath that fear, a resilient optimism stubbornly flickered, a faint light promising that if he just kept pushing, kept enduring, kept shouldering his burdens alone, they'd get there. Eventually. The 5 a.m. alarm was less a sudden jolt and more a low, insistent growl from the bedside table, a daily summons that Garrett answered with a practiced, weary efficiency. He'd swing his feet to the cold linoleum, the groan from his knees a familiar tune, and move through the pre-dawn quiet of the house. The air usually held a faint whisper of toast or Sarah's strong coffee, small anchors in the encroaching day. He'd pack his lunch himself, same thermos, same hearty sandwich, sometimes an apple, and grab his keys from the hook by the door, the weight of them feeling heavier each year. The drive to the factory was a blur of dim streetlights and familiar, pockmarked asphalt. the industrial skyline on the horizon a monstrous silhouette against the paling sky. The building itself was a beast of metal and noise, a place where the air hung thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone, where the constant clang and hiss became the rhythm of his life. Garrett's station was a section of the main assembly line, a repetitive, mind-numbing dance with a hydraulic press that shaped raw steel into parts for heavy machinery. For 8, sometimes 10 hours, he'd feed the metal, trigger the press, and stack the finished pieces, his movements precise, automatic, born of 2 decades of repetition. His hands, strong and thick with calluses, were not shaping wood for a boat or delicately baiting a hook, but wrestling with cold, unyielding steel. Every week the paychecks landed, and every week they seemed to evaporate before the ink was dry. The mortgage on their modest house, the truck payment, the electric bill that crept higher with every passing summer and winter. Lily's school supplies, Mark's new shoes that he'd outgrown almost overnight. Groceries, the constant, bottomless pit of sustenance for a growing family. Sarah's meager spending money for the occasional treat. There was always a leak in the boat, always another bill he hadn't fully anticipated, always the sense of treading water, barely keeping his head above the current. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, a worn calculator and a pile of envelopes spread before him, the yellow glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across his tired face. He'd trace figures, subtract, add, subtract again, trying to stretch what little they had just a bit further. The gap between what came in and what went out felt like a chasm. The dream of that fishing boat, of the sun on his face and the quiet lap of water, of a real vacation for Sarah and the kids, it was still there, a faint glimmer in the back of his mind. But it was buried deeper now, under the weight of utility bills and school fees and the ever-present hum of the truck needing another oil change. It felt less like a future he was working towards and more like a cruel mirage, shimmering just out of reach. That resilient optimism he carried, the one that promised eventually, was being worn down by the relentless now. He saw the gap between Garrett, the factory worker, providing, enduring, and Garrett, the man who once imagined a life of simpler joys. It wasn't just a financial gap. It was a chasm of lost time, of squandered energy, of dreams slowly, quietly suffocating under the mundane, necessary fight for today. He harbored the deep fear of failing them, a tightening in his chest every time Lily talked about college or Mark asked for a new video game. He just kept pushing, kept enduring, kept shouldering those burdens alone because what else was there to do? His head above the current. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, a worn calculator and a pile of envelopes spread before him, the yellow glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across his tired face. He'd trace figures, subtract, add, subtract again, trying to stretch what little they had just a bit further. The gap between what came in and what went out felt like a chasm. The dream of that fishing boat, of the sun on his face and the quiet lap of water, of a real vacation for Sarah and the kids, it was still there, a faint glimmer in the back of his mind. But it was buried deeper now, under the weight of utility bills and school fees and the ever-present hum of the truck needing another oil change. It felt less like a future he was working towards and more like a cruel mirage, shimmering just out of reach. That resilient optimism he carried, the one that promised eventually, was being worn down by the relentless now. He saw the gap between Garrett, the factory worker, providing, enduring, and Garrett, the man who once imagined a life of simpler joys. It wasn't just a financial gap. It was a chasm of lost time, of squandered energy, of dreams slowly, quietly suffocating under the mundane, necessary fight for today. He harbored the deep fear of failing them, a tightening in his chest every time Lily talked about college or Mark asked for a new video game. He just kept pushing, kept enduring, kept shouldering those burdens alone, because what else was there to do? The alarm clock, a chipped gray rectangle, usually screamed at 4:55 a.m. Garrett rarely heard it, though. His body, tuned to the rhythm of the plant, often stirred a minute or two before the buzzer. A sigh, heavy and silent, would escape him as he swung his feet onto the cold linoleum floor of his bedroom. Sarah would be a warm lump beside him, still asleep, and he'd try to move quiet as a ghost, not wanting to disturb her. The morning ritual was carved in stone. A quick splash of cold water on his face, the strong black coffee that tasted like burnt ambition, and a piece of dry toast. He'd pull on the same faded work jeans, the same sturdy boots, the same gray Union t-shirt that had long lost its softness. Each item of clothing a uniform of his existence, signaling another day of the same. By 5:30 a.m., his old Ford F-150, which sounded more like a rattling can of bolts than a truck these days, would be rumbling out of the driveway. The half-hour drive to the plant was a blur of sleepy streetlights and familiar turns, his mind already drifting to the first bell, the clang of metal, the drone of machinery that would be his companion for the next 10, sometimes 12 hours. He worked on the assembly line, a position he'd held for over 2 decades. His hands, calloused and thick-fingered, were extensions of the machinery, fitting bolts, tightening clamps, inspecting welds. The work was endless, repetitive, and demanded a kind of mindless focus that allowed his thoughts to wander even as his body stayed rigidly on task. He'd watch the parts move down the line, each one identical, each one destined for some far-off place he'd never see. It wasn't a bad job, not really. It paid the bills, mostly. It just was. The plant was a symphony of industrial noise, the hiss of hydraulics, the grind of conveyors, the occasional shriek of metal on metal. Garrett knew every sound, every rhythm. He could tell by the hum if a machine was running right or if it was about to throw a fit. The air hung heavy with the smell of oil, sweat, and something metallic, a scent that clung to his clothes and hair even after a shower. Lunch was a quick sandwich, often eaten alone at a greasy picnic table in the break room, listening to the chatter of younger guys, their futures still bright and unblemished. He'd nod, maybe offer a gruff word or two if someone spoke to him, but mostly he kept to himself. His mind would drift back to the pile of envelopes on his kitchen table, to the numbers that never seemed to quite add up. The truck needed new tires, Sarah's eyeglasses prescription was outdated, and Lily was going to need money for that school trip soon. Every penny counted, every hour of overtime was snatched up, even if it meant coming home later, even more exhausted. That quiet ambition for a better, simpler life for his family, it was still flickering inside him, a stubborn ember. But the constant fight to keep their heads above water had layered it with a thick coat of ash. He pictured the small fishing boat, a modest 20-footer cutting through the calm waters of the bay. He could almost feel the sun on his face, the tug of a line, the genuine, unburdened laughter of his kids. But then the imagined scene would dissolve, replaced by the stark reality of the bills, the demands, the relentless present. He carried a deep fear of failing them, a tightening knot behind his ribs that never quite loosened. He saw it in the way Lily sometimes looked at new clothes in a store, then quickly looked away, sensing the unspoken budget. He heard it in Mark's carefully phrased requests for new toys, always with an assurance he didn't really need it. It gnawed at him, the feeling that he was always just barely providing, never thriving. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and Sarah was asleep beside him, he'd find himself staring at the ceiling. He'd remember a younger Garrett, full of bluster and big plans, fresh out of high school, convinced that hard work was the only compass you needed. That Garrett thought success was a linear path, a straight shot from effort to reward. He hadn't accounted for the hidden costs, the invisible taxes on your spirit, the constant need to divert resources from your future dreams just to maintain the present. He struggled to articulate these deeper feelings, these quiet anxieties, even to Sarah. What was there to say, really? "Honey, I'm scared we're never going to get ahead. I'm scared I'm not enough." She worked, too, just as hard, balancing the house and the kids and her own part-time job. Adding his own unspoken burdens felt like another weight on her shoulders, and he couldn't do that. So he kept it all locked up, a silent testament to his unwavering commitment, but also a cage for his self-doubt. He was a man made of quiet strengths, enduring, practical, but inside, a quiet voice whispered, "Is this all there is?" That voice was his most persistent demon, always there, just at the edge of hearing. His resilient optimism, once a sturdy mast against the storms of life, was now frayed, worn thin by years of relentless struggle. He still pushed forward because that's what a man did. He still believed in eventually. But the eventually was getting harder to see, shrouded in the smoke and steam of the factory floor, obscured by the growing pile of bills. He had become a man whose dreams were less about reaching a destination and more about just staying afloat. And that, more than anything, was beginning to weigh him down. He felt like a rower on an endless river, pulling against the current, the shore always receding, the strength in his arms slowly, inexorably draining away. That sense of an endless, draining pull on the oars, it was just the warm-up act. The real show, the one where the bottom started to drop out, began quietly, almost innocently, with a grind beneath the hood of his old F-150. Garrett had that truck for 15 years, faithful as a dog, tough as nails. So when it started coughing and sputtering on the way to the plant one cold Tuesday morning, he figured it was a tune-up, maybe a belt. A couple $100 tops. He dropped it off at Miller's garage, waved to old Frank Miller, and hitched a ride with a buddy. He was even whistling a little, thinking about how he'd probably saved enough for a decent used motor for that fishing boat by Christmas. Then the phone call came. It wasn't a belt. It wasn't a tune-up. It was the transmission. Blown, $2,800, a gut punch. He felt the air leave his lungs like he'd taken a hit from a sledgehammer. That money, that precious, slowly accumulated pile of future money, it had been earmarked for boat parts, for maybe even putting a down payment on a small, used pontoon. Now it was going into an engine bay, just to keep him moving, just to stay in place. He signed the papers with a grim set to his jaw, telling Sarah it was just a setback. He watched a good chunk of his boat fund disappear, sucked into the everyday maw of necessity. A knot began to form in his stomach, tighter than any he'd ever tied for a fishing line. He hadn't even fully recovered from the truck when the second wave hit, bigger, colder. It started as a pain in Sarah's side, a dull ache that she tried to ignore for days, being Sarah. Then it sharpened, twisting her face pale green one night after dinner. Garrett rushed her to the ER, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was her appendix. Emergency surgery. The fear for her, the agonizing wait in the sterile hospital corridor, that was a cost beyond any number. But then came the bills. Even with insurance, the deductible, the copays, the follow-up appointments, it was another $2 grand. That second hit didn't just dent the remaining boat fund, it hollowed it out. Now he was looking at his emergency savings, the just-in-case money meant for the kids' college or a truly dire situation. This was dire. He paid it, of course, without a second thought, because Sarah was his anchor, his bedrock. But the ache in his stomach had now spread to his chest, a dull, constant throb. He looked at the almost empty savings account and felt a cold dread creep in. The shore of his dream, already receding, now seemed to vanish entirely behind a fog of medical receipts and repair invoices. The final blow, the one that cracked the last vestiges of his linear faith and hard work, arrived a month later, riding on a note from Lily's dentist. Significant overcrowding. Braces recommended. Cost, $4,500 over 2 years. Lily, his sweet Lily, already self-conscious about her gap. He looked at her earnest, hopeful face, her shy smile, and knew there was no choice. How could he deny her that? How could he tell her, "Sorry, honey, Dad's boat fund is more important"? The words died in his throat. He just nodded, squeezed Sarah's hand, and felt something inside him finally give. 3 major hits in 6 months. Truck, wife's health, daughter's future. Each one peeling away a layer of his carefully constructed financial stability. Each one draining resources he needed not for some distant dream, but for today, for right now, for the people he loved most. He sat at the kitchen table that night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, the moonlight slicing across the worn linoleum. The dream, that simple, clear image of him and his family on a fishing boat, laughing, casting lines, it wasn't just on hold. It was actively being consumed. His pursuit of a better life had become a desperate scramble just to keep their heads above water. Success, he realized with a bitter taste in his mouth, wasn't just about achieving a goal. It was about relentless, often painful trade-offs. He felt like he was cutting off his own arm to feed his family, only to find they were still hungry. It was 3 a.m. when he finally gave up on sleep. The house was quiet, a deep, heavy quiet that pressed in on him. He walked through the dark, familiar rooms, a ghost in his own home. He stood by Lily's bedroom door, listening to her soft, even breathing. Then Mark's. Then he found himself in the living room, staring out the window at the familiar silhouette of the oak tree in the front yard. Brutal honesty clawed at him, tearing at the edges of his weary mind. What had his life become? A treadmill, that's what. A goddamn treadmill. He pushed and pushed, thinking he was moving forward, but he was just running in place, getting nowhere. His muscles ached, his mind was numb, and the finish line was perpetually out of reach. He'd always believed in the equation. Hard work equals reward, sweat equity. Put in the time, put in the effort, and eventually it'll pay off. That's what his old man taught him. That's what the world was supposed to be. But the world, it seemed, had a different set of books. Every time he squirreled away a few bucks, every time he thought he was getting ahead, life would throw another curveball, another bill, another crisis, and that money would get swallowed whole. It wasn't just money disappearing, it was hope. It was the belief that he could ever break free from the cycle. He was a factory man through and through. His hands, thick and scarred, bore the marks of his devotion. But what had that devotion gotten him? A well-maintained, older house, sure, food on the table. Clothes on their backs. But where was the better life he dreamed of? Where was the simpler life? It felt like a cruel joke. He was sacrificing his present comfort, his peace of mind, just to maintain the status quo, to keep his family from slipping backwards. The quiet ambition he harbored, that picture of the fishing boat, it suddenly felt indulgent, foolish, even selfish. He'd been trying to build a future, only to find that the present was a hungry beast, devouring every spare crumb he offered. A wave of self-doubt washed over him, cold and sharp. Was he a fool? Was he naive to think a man like him could ever truly get ahead, not just survive? He'd carried these burdens alone for so long, trying to be the strong one, the silent one. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of his living room, the weight felt unbearable. He was a man drowning not in water, but in the relentless tide of responsibilities and unexpected costs, watching his dreams sink without a trace. And the worst part, he didn't know how to swim to shore anymore. All he knew was how to keep treading water, barely. The raw, brutal truth hit him like a physical blow. Some dreams, no matter how beautiful, demanded more than just effort. They demanded a piece of you, a fundamental part of your current existence that he might not be ready or even able to give. He was losing himself in the grind, and he couldn't let that happen. Not yet. Not while they still needed him. The air grew heavy around him, not with smoke, but with the dust of shattered expectations. He stared at his calloused hands, hands that had built and repaired, lifted and carried, but now felt strangely empty, inadequate. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was a mocking counterpoint to the turmoil inside him. Enough. The word wasn't a shout, or even a whisper, but a solid brick settling in his chest. Enough of chasing a horizon that kept receding. Enough of sacrificing today's peace for a tomorrow that only seemed to demand more. He wasn't giving up on a better life, not entirely. But he was giving up on the way he'd been chasing it, on this relentless self-sacrifice that was bleeding his family dry, piece by agonizing piece. He didn't know what he was going to do differently, not yet. But he knew with a clarity that stung his eyes that he couldn't keep doing this slow, quiet unraveling of his soul. The 5 a.m. alarm, a cruel, familiar siren, ripped him from a fitful sleep. Habit, a thick, binding rope, pulled him towards the same old routine. Coffee, toast, lunch packed for the factory. But as he stood by the sink, the half-eaten toast forgotten, his gaze drifted to the small calendar tacked to the fridge. Sarah had circled Lily's orthodontist appointment next month, a stark reminder of another looming cost. He thought about the fishing boat, the dream that had once been his North Star, now just a dim, distant flicker. That boat, that simple freedom, it suddenly felt less like a dream and more like a symbol of everything he couldn't afford, not just financially, but emotionally. He couldn't drain another drop from his family's well-being to fill his own. The real win, he realized with a jolt, wasn't about getting the boat. It was about keeping the family, keeping them whole. Instead of grabbing his usual packed lunch, a symbol of the cheap, quick fuel he needed for the grind, he pulled out a notebook and a pencil from the kitchen drawer. He wouldn't be going to work today thinking only about the next breakdown, the next bill. He'd go thinking about how to build a different kind of shore, one where they could all stand firm together. The factory clock would still demand its pound of flesh, but today, Garrett was taking back a little piece of his mind. That first step, a decision as quiet as the dawn, felt heavier than any steel beam he'd ever lifted. It was hard, almost impossibly so, to break the ingrained patterns of a lifetime. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something beyond weariness. Purpose, redefined. Day one of this new purpose didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like trying to push a broken-down truck uphill. He brought the small, spiral-bound notebook to work, tucked deep in the inner pocket of his worn canvas jacket, almost like a secret. During his first 15-minute break, while the other guys huddled around the coffee pot, cracking jokes about the weekend, Garrett found a quiet corner by a stack of finished pallets. His fingers, usually calloused and strong, felt clumsy holding the pencil. He didn't know what to write. A different kind of shore, what did that even mean? He started small, listing the week's expenses, trying to find a pattern, a leak. The numbers blurred. The clang of metal on metal from the main floor was a constant, drumming reminder of where he was, what he was. He felt a ridiculous pang of self-consciousness, as if his rough hands, meant for levers and wrenches, looked foolish wrestling with a pencil. The bell for breakover screeched, and he snapped the notebook shut, feeling a familiar weight settle back on his shoulders. One small step, maybe, but the mountain still loomed. By day 3, the initial flicker of purpose was battling a growing tide of exhaustion. The late nights spent poring over utility bills and insurance statements, trying to find $1 to save, were stealing from his already meager sleep. His head throbbed with the constant hum of the machinery, and his eyes, already tired, felt gritty. He tried to skip lunch on Tuesday to get ahead on some calculations, but the hunger gnawed at him, making him irritable, snippy even with poor Mark when he asked about a school project. He found himself slipping back into old habits, staring blankly at the walls during his breaks, the notebook lying untouched in his locker. What's the point? A voice whispered in the back of his mind. It's just numbers. The bills will still be there. The truck will still break. Lily will still need those damn braces. He'd almost left the notebook home that morning, the sheer futility of it all pressing down on him like a vice. But then he'd seen Lily's half-finished homework on the kitchen table, an algebra problem she'd struggled with. He remembered her face when she'd asked him for help and he'd been too tired, too preoccupied. He stuffed the notebook into his bag. Not for a boat, he reminded himself. For them? The battle raged on, quiet but relentless. By the end of the first week, he managed to carve out 15 minutes each evening, after Sarah and the kids were asleep, to sit at the kitchen table. The silence of the house was a stark contrast to the factory floor, yet his mind was often still buzzing with the day's din. He wasn't solving world hunger, just slowly, painstakingly, outlining a budget, looking for small cuts, researching cheaper car insurance. There were days, like the Tuesday of the second week, when the frustration boiled over. He'd spent an hour trying to decipher a medical bill that looked like it was written in a foreign language, only to find a late fee he could have avoided if he'd just had more time to deal with it earlier. He slammed the pencil down, the soft wood cracking. The small sound echoed in the quiet kitchen, loud in his ears. He wanted to just throw the whole thing away, collapse into bed, and let the current just carry him wherever it wanted. This is too much, he thought. I'm not built for this kind of thinking. I'm built for lifting, for fixing, for grinding, not for this paper chase. He almost failed that night, almost let the despair swallow him whole. His hands, aching from the day's work, longed for the simple oblivion of sleep. But then, as he stood at the sink, rinsing the cracked pencil, his eyes caught the reflection in the dark window. Not his own face, but the faint, ghostly outline of his small house, lights dim within. Saw Sarah's steady presence, Lily's bright ambition, Mark's boundless energy. He remembered the feeling of helplessness when the truck broke down, the panic when Sarah had her emergency. He didn't want to feel that again. He could. His flaw, his tendency to shoulder burdens alone, was also his strength, fueling an unwavering commitment. He picked up the pencil carefully and returned to the table. The numbers still looked like a tangled mess, but he began again, one line at a time. He wasn't trying to build a boat anymore. He was building a raft, stout and steady for his family. And that, he realized, was a much harder, much more important kind of construction. He might stumble, he might even fall, but quitting, that wasn't an option. Not for them. The following weeks blurred into a rhythm Garrett recognized, yet it felt subtly different. The early alarm still screamed at 5 a.m., the factory floor still hummed with the same droning machinery, and the bills still found their way to the kitchen table. But Garrett, though no less weary, carried himself with a new kind of quiet purpose. He wasn't chasing the ghost of a fishing boat anymore. He was meticulously shoring up the foundations of his life. Every spare dollar wasn't squirreled away for a future dream, but funneled into fixing the small, persistent leaks that had plagued their existence. The dripping faucet got a new washer, the loose porch step a new bracket. He started packing his own lunch more often, a thermos of coffee instead of a drive-through, saving just a few dollars here and there. It felt like tiny, insignificant acts, but multiplied over days and weeks, they became a bulwark. Sarah noticed it first. He was still quiet, perhaps even more so, but the agitated, tight-wound edge that had been there for months had softened. One evening, as he methodically tightened a squeaky hinge on the pantry door, she leaned against the frame, watching him. "You've been different lately, Garrett," she said, her voice soft, not accusing, just observing. He paused, the screwdriver still in his hand, and looked at her. A faint smile touched his lips, a genuine one that reached his tired eyes. "Just trying to keep things from falling apart, I guess," he mumbled, turning back to the hinge. But Sarah saw the underlying meaning. He wasn't just reacting to things falling apart, he was proactively making sure they wouldn't. He was building his raft, one steady plank at a time. At the factory, his foreman, a gruff man named Henderson who rarely offered praise, pulled him aside one Tuesday. "You've been sharp lately, Garrett, catching things before they go wrong." Garrett just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't explain he was looking at every machine, every process, not just as a job, but as another potential breakdown, another unplanned expense, another drain on his family's stability. He was seeing the hidden costs everywhere. Hope, that fragile thing, didn't return with a grand fanfare. It seeped back in slowly like groundwater through dry earth. It wasn't the fiery, ambitious hope of a grand future, but a calmer, more resilient kind of hope. The hope that tomorrow would be manageable, that the present was secure. Weeks turned into a couple of months. Garrett was still the same man, still clocked in and out of the same factory, still lived in the same modest house. But his eyes were different. They still held the deep lines of a working man's weariness, but now there was a depth to them, a quiet wisdom. He still dreamed, yes, but the dreams were different. One Saturday afternoon, he didn't spend his time online looking at boat listings. Instead, he took Lily and Mark down to the small, muddy creek that ran behind their town, poles in hand. He showed Mark how to bait a hook, how to cast without snagging a tree. He just sat there watching them, feeling the warm sun on his face, listening to their chatter. No grand ocean adventure, no shimmering blue water, just a murky creek and the sound of his children's laughter. And it was enough. More than enough. It was perfect. That evening, as he helped Sarah clear the dinner table, he finally put words to the shift within him. "You know," he said, looking at the worn wood of the table, his hands tracing a faint scratch, "I used to think success was all about getting something you didn't have. A bigger house, a fancy car, a boat. That fishing boat. That was my big idea." He paused, searching for the right words. "I thought if I worked hard enough, I'd just get there. Simple as that." He looked up, meeting Sarah's gaze. "But what they don't tell you is what you gotta give up along the way. Your time, your peace, sometimes even what you already got. That dream ain't just a finish line, it's a whole damn toll road, and the tickets keep getting steeper." I realized I was so focused on buying that boat, I almost sank the one I was already sailing in. The one with you and the kids in it. Sarah reached out, gently touching his calloused hand. "So you're not gonna buy a boat?" she asked, a hint of sadness but mostly understanding in her voice. Garrett shook his head slowly. "Maybe one day for a different reason, but not like before, not if it means risking what we have. Sometimes just keeping what you got is the real win. Keeping it steady, keeping it safe. That's the real treasure." And Garrett, he became a different kind of rich, not with money or possessions, but with a quiet, unshakable contentment in the present. He learned that the price of a dream isn't just measured in dollars and cents. It's measured in everything you could lose trying to reach it. And sometimes,